the idea of this morning session is really to build, kind of step two of the process, right? Step two of design thinking. Now, again, this should stand alone on its own, whether you were at the prototyping session or not last week. The prototyping session, the video for it is up now, so you can go back and watch it if you want to. But this is a session that we think has value even beyond where it fits into design thinking, but it's obviously a critical step of design thinking. And so the way we'll proceed with the morning is I'm gonna kind of talk a little bit about the design thinking aspects and why this fits in. I'm gonna hand it off to my colleague, Monica Rezac. Who is really an expert in this area of qualitative inquiry, and she's gonna dig a little deeper for people. And then when we get into the Q&A, Monica and I can trade off depending on what the question is regarding the topic at hand. So again, design thinking process, this is the formal process, but it's, as we talked about last week, you can throw prototyping at the beginning. There's a lot of different ways you can get there. What we're really just trying to get at is human-centered solution development in this process. And it's imperative that if we're going to do human-centered solution development, that we have to cultivate an attitude of empathy. Now, empathy and sympathy, I don't think is probably going to be a distinction that's hard for the people on this chat to understand. But I do think it's worth kind of underlying that what we really are talking about is empathy and not sympathy. And what we really want to know when we talk about from an empathy perspective is, what is it like to live in someone else's experience? And in the case of design thinking, the experience we really care about is the individual or individuals in particular that are experiencing the condition that's problematic for one reason or another. The reason that empathy becomes so critically important is that this approach is built on the fundamental idea that the people who are experiencing the condition have the greatest insight into how the solution can change their lives. And I know that seems apparent, but when you think about traditional program development and the traditional way we go about doing things, is we tend to have a bias towards expertise. And look, I went to school for a very long time in the hopes that someday somebody would call me an expert. So I don't dislike expertise. I love expertise. But what I do also recognize is that my lived experience is different than the lived experience of someone else. And if we don't at some point take into account the lived experience of the individual who we're trying to help, then we're planning on them instead of with them. And the approach of beginning with empathy or maintaining a spirit of empathy throughout the entire process is that spirit of moving from planning on people to planning with people, to allowing the people who are experiencing a condition to be a part of the solution to the experience. And so as you would expect, different data approaches lend themselves better to making sure we're working from an empathetic perspective. And that's really where the qualitative piece is going to come into play today, and why we're emphasizing it as a very critical piece to this process, but just good management, good leadership, and good program development, period, in the nonprofit sector. Also, though, for the for-profit sector. One of the things that we will talk about, we'll generally talk about an interview approach to collecting data, but it would be lost on me if I did not at least, I'd be remiss if I did not at least mention the key role of observation. So when we typically think about data collection, we almost always think about us interacting directly with someone who is giving us their feedback. And that's good. And that is oftentimes 80% of data collection, 90% of data collection, right? But another way that we can collect data is by simply observing how people are living their lives, right? Where do they run into barriers? Where are things easy for them? Is it easier for some populations than others? Observation is a very powerful tool, and it's one that I would encourage you to try and think about in your own circumstances and organizations of how you can employ observation on a regular basis just to better understand your customer's lived experience or your client's lived experience. Right? Colorful slide here, and again, I'm always grateful to my colleague who's on these calls, Brittany Boomer, who designed all these slides. So if you ever need help with slides or presentation materials, call Brittany. But let's get back to the content here. Is that the idea here is the top slide is kind of how it feels, is my image of how we traditionally collect data, right? Or how we interact with the populations that we serve. We're the person with the megaphone, and they feel like we're constantly bombarding them, either with requests for their information, or we're telling them what we know and what they don't know, or we're telling them what they should think instead of asking them what they think. And what we're arguing for today, at least, is the bottom picture, right? Become a part of, right? Become a part of the community that you're trying to understand better. That there is a philosophy that underpins qualitative research that says to truly understand, you have to become a part of or immerse yourself in a system. That you can only understand to a certain degree if you are apart from that system. One of the reasons for that is what we do know about how people respond to and give information is that it's the iceberg theory, right? Or the iceberg comparison. Is that what people say is really only about 10% of the story, right? And think about it. We've done it on here with the navigation series. We've asked you what you like and don't like. Did you like content? Did you not like content? Did you like a breakout? Did you not like a breakout? And trust me, we would love to give you the opportunity to give short answers. Zoom just doesn't allow us to. So, but what we are stuck with then is this kind of quantitative data that says you either like something or you don't like something, or with some degree of intensity because it's a 5-point scale. When we observe and when we actually have conversations with people, when we engage with people in the data collection process through qualitative data, we can also begin to capture what they don't say. And here's kind of the way I look at these things, right? So think about the difference between having a conversation with someone over text or email and having a conversation with someone in person. Anybody on this Zoom ever had a misunderstanding with someone on text or email because of words versus tone, affect, expression? Well, the same thing's true when you think about data collection. You can get the actual words, you can get the specific rankings or ratings that someone gives you, but you don't get the story behind it. And you don't get the context with which they're providing. We assume it, right? We hope it's a sterile environment. We're assuming a certain degree of static environment, a certain degree of error when we use that kind of quantitative data. Versus if someone's telling me, if Monica and I are having a conversation, and I use her because her picture is the one that's up in my screen right now. But if we're having a conversation, let's say about education programs, and well, she may say something like, yeah, it was a good program, but at the same time, you see her kind of slump in her chair a little bit, or her face kind of grimaces when she says the word okay, or that she doesn't express the emotions of joy that come with, you know, a positive experience. That's part of the data process from an empathetic perspective. That is part of what we want to know. That's part of telling the whole story about education programs. And so if given the opportunity, and through what qualitative processes do give me, is the opportunity to say, you know, I hear you saying you had a good experience, but I also kind of observed that maybe there might be a little bit more there. Were there parts of it that were really frustrating? Were there parts of it that maybe detracted from the overall positive experience? And then she has the opportunity to go into more detail about some of those types of what also lies beneath the water. And so one of the things I really want to drive home, and this isn't a criticism of it because the Midwest Center does it as much as any of you on this call, is that simply providing a short answer response box for people on a survey is not the same thing as what we're talking about today. I want to make that very clear. It is qualitative, but it's not the level of depth that we're still talking about today. It doesn't give you the opportunity to still fully understand the person's experience and what else they're trying to tell you or communicate to you as you have asked them questions. In fact, Dave Renz would be, remembers this individual also, but when I started at the university, there was someone by the name of Dick Heimovix, Professor Heimovix, who was at the Block School, and he's an old school researcher and did not like mail survey. Like, this was when mail surveys were technology, not let alone email surveys. And he was a big believer that it wasn't data collection unless you were in front of somebody filling out the survey with them. And part of the reason for that is exactly what we're talking about today. It's exactly about the full spectrum of communication that humans do when asked a question. It's not just about the words we express, it's also about the physicality, the affects, the tone. It's about all of those things that are critically important, that are all data points in the data collection process. So if we really want to get at what's causing someone pain and what brings them joy, which is really what we're trying to do in this design process, is get to one of those things, find out one of those things, so that we can either accentuate the joy or spread the joy, scale the joy, or remedy the pain. Then we need an approach that allows us to understand the feelings, the emotions, the thoughts, the experiences of an individual, not just the description of what their experience is. And so, as I'm going to talk a little, just hit on a couple more points on this slide, and then I'm going to hand it over to Monica to go into some depth on ethnography and a couple other pieces, which is really just a fancy academic word for talk to people or spend time with people. But so if we really want the whole experience, if we want to go deeper than just what people can tell us, and if the purpose of the design process from a data perspective, and I would argue the purpose of any good program development process or problem solving, even solving a leadership conundrum, we've talked about 4 frames in this series before. If what we really want to know is what's really going on, then what we really need to dig into in here, in addition to what people say, is what's underneath what they say. And here are a variety of approaches you can do with it. Interviewing is probably going to be the most common, and so the worksheet that we put together was really an interview worksheet, because it's probably going to make up 90% of the data collection you would do in a process like this. I'm going to let Monica get into ethnography. The one I want to point to, though, real quick, is survey data. And the reason I'm pointing to survey data is that it seems counterintuitive to what I've been talking about, and candidly it is. But what we do want to remember is that we're trying to build a whole picture, and survey data can actually provide a context from which we can do deeper levels of data collection through interviews and other things, right? So if I understand the demographics of my population, I can then begin to segment out people from the different demographics to understand how pervasive a given condition is or a given experience is within the total population that I serve. And survey data is actually, quantitative data in particular, is extremely effective for helping us understand the breadth and depth of a problem once we have a better understanding of what the problem is. And so that's probably enough from me before I turn it over to you, Monica. So why don't you kind of kick in and take them down this path of ethnography and qualitative data in general.
Okay, so there are lots of ways that you can gather data for your process. Scott mentioned a few of those. The example that we have in our worksheet today is an ethnographic interview approach, and it's one way that you can gather human-centered data to really understand those who will be experiencing your program or product. So human-centered data, it just means that we're really getting to the story, the human condition, the human experience, which you can't always gain from just doing like a poll or a survey. So ethnography is a style of qualitative research. Scott mentioned it's just like a fancy word for basically getting in the mix of the culture, the environment that you're wanting to learn more about. So it's really focused on the culture of a group. So it's not purely observational, it's meant to be immersive. You're seeking to really immerse yourself. So at a minimum, your mindset, if not your entire experience, into the world of those you're gathering research about and who you're trying to develop a program or a product for. So what we mean by ethnography in the context of design thinking is to gather more of that immersive data about the group of the people you're serving and creating that product for, and you can do that by interviewing, observing, having conversations, all of the above. So you're not necessarily going to embed yourself in the daily life of those you're creating for, although you may. Ethnography traditionally is really kind of like long-term and very embedded. But for the purposes of design thinking and creating a program or a product, you're really seeking to gain those insights about what the needs are there and develop that for that. So ethnography, at its core, it really seeks to honor the leader and the learner in every person. So what that means is that you want to uncover what the group you're working with knows that you don't by being a part of that group. So what can they teach you, but also what are they seeking to know themselves? And this tells you a lot about where the needs are, which will help you as you're developing a program or a product. So this connection to the situation where you can really connect to those people and to those experiences that they're having helps you better understand what you can create or offer as a service to them, as opposed to sitting in an office somewhere and theorizing about what that might be. Naturally, it's going to be, again, it's very empathetic. It's very much like putting yourself in that person's shoes. So it's really about the heart and putting yourself into that person's situation. It's going to be much more emotion driven, and so not necessarily as easy to report as raw numbers, but arguably it's just as important because it tells you what the numbers can't, right? Which is the human story, which is incredibly informative as you're creating. So again, what Scott said, you're looking for what's not being said. So you're going to do your interviews, you're going to have your observations, you're going to look to see what's not being said and really try to uncover that through the questions that you ask and the type of and the quality of interaction that you have with people. So one tactic is to interview participants, and we'll provide an example for that. But another tactic would be to have respondents participate in your prototype process. Any qualitative research may not be the answer per se. Qualitative research doesn't really give you like the numbers that you would get in concrete data that we typically think of, but it can be the inspiration for the next step of the process. So I think that's really the essence of what ethnography is. And then our worksheet goes into a little bit of an example of how you can apply that.
Great, thanks. I really like the idea of not looking for the solution, but the inspiration, right? And when you think about so much of what you all work on a regular basis, that's really the inherent value of connecting with your stakeholders, right? Your clients, your donors, all of these various people that surround your organization and support your organizations, is you're looking for them to provide the raw materials of inspiration that through a process, whether it be design thinking or other, you can ultimately turn into the solution set, right? I think the other thing I would emphasize, and I would argue it's our spirit for the entire 6 steps or 6 sessions of this, is we're arguing for creating a culture of these approaches, right? So to Monica's larger point about ethnography, if you're doing it in an academic context, right, you're looking at maybe years to do a proper academic ethnography. We get that you don't have years to develop a program. We're not arguing for you to do that. However, why not create a culture of observation, of exploration, of empathy as it relates to your end users in such a way that this process, even as the program is developed, doesn't have to end. It becomes then part of the evaluation process. It becomes then part of the developing new inspiration for the evolution of the idea. things along those lines. And so as we kind of get into, the worksheet's going to be very point in time, and I'll get into that now. But one of the things I think is critical is that we will continue to come back to, Monica and I will, throughout this entire series, is how do you build a culture of these practices in such a way that they position you so that we're not, the goal here isn't for it to add work to your plate. And even with this interview tool, which is up on the screen now and is in box for those of you who haven't downloaded it yet, the goal isn't to add to your time, but if you could incorporate this approach to engaging with your stakeholders, you're already engaging with stakeholders. So why not make that engagement a little more meaningful? That's the spirit of what we're trying to come at today's session with, right? Are you a good observer of the clients? Are you observing how they, when you walk through a classroom or a lobby or a program site, are you just walking through, or are you walking through as a trained observer to see how people are interacting? Because when you can cultivate that, then you've really taken in the spirit of what this ethnographic approach is really about. So,
Scott, the worksheet's not showing up there.
Oh, it's not? Thank you.
Yeah, let's go to your slide.
We can, I'm gonna have to stop share and reshare is how it works. Thank you. How about now?
Yeah.
We good? Great.
Yep.
All right, so I'm not going to go step by step through this worksheet. I just want to kind of highlight a couple of points to it that I hope will be particularly useful to you. There is or I don't even know if you call this a worksheet as much as a tool, but I called it a worksheet, so call it whatever you like. It's a reference tool if nothing else, right? And we kind of capture the spirit of what the goal is of this interview process. Again, tone should be conversational. And this will come up a variety of times in the process. If you can record these sessions so that you can just have a conversation with people, all the better. You have to give people's permission to record them. So we're not telling you to record them secretly, but if you can record, that's even better, because then you can just have a conversation with someone. Some things to think about as you approach certain populations, right? So, if people have language skills complications for a variety of reasons. We did this when we worked with kids in the Urban Youth Academy. We gathered feedback by having them draw pictures. Picture drawing, building collages, doing a visual ethnography with a camera. These are all ways that people can provide input if they have if there are language skill issues. If someone is English as a second language person, and it's possible to have a native speaker do the interview, do it, right? These are all little tips along the way that may be useful to you. If you don't, you can have a translator. Translators are better than nothing, but in an ideal world, this would be conversational. So if you have a native language speaker, people will be more comfortable. They'll be more relaxed. They'll be more willing to engage and share with you. It's trust building. The one that I want to make sure I'm clear about when it comes to gender norm barriers, if that is a barrier, it won't always be a barrier. But there are populations who work with individuals who may be victims of domestic violence, or they could be representatives of a non-binary group. If you can have an interviewer who is relatable, who is of that group, so you wouldn't necessarily want to send me in. If Monica and I are on the research team, you wouldn't necessarily want to send me in to a woman who is the victim of domestic violence at the hands of a male. You'd want to send Monica, right? Because you don't want there to be a barrier to the conversation, anything that would hold that up. So these are things to be thinking about. The other thing to think about is cultural norms, right? We're a diverse metro area with people from different parts of the world, fairly significant refugee populations. Understand the community that you're trying to research. Make sure that your conversations are consistent with cultural norms so that people can be comfortable. Remember, you're trying to understand from their perspective. And the best way to do that is to start with a norm set that is comfortable for them. And then finally, vulnerable populations, training experts to collect the data can be good. Training people who know how to work with the vulnerable populations, or people from that population, again, can be good. The other thing we provided is some sample questions, right? I want to make a very clear point. These aren't, we're not telling you you have to use these, but if you're trying to build an ethnographic interview sheet, we thought that this might be useful as just kind of prompts to get you going, right? And the first and the last one I want to take a second and say something about. I think the other ones kind of speak for themselves. There will be populations you work with that if you just ask them, take a minute, if you said, take a minute or two and tell me a little bit more about yourself, they're going to come back with nothing, bupkis, right? And so if they have potentially education limitations or barriers to understanding, or they're a younger population, you may be better starting with the probes. Like, tell me something you really like. What makes you happy? Tell me something you dislike or something that makes you very unhappy. Have there been any changes recently in your home? Anything along those lines? And then for the sixth one, the same thing, right? For it being too open-ended, like, you know, tell me what your best life looks like, or tell me what your life looks like in 5 years, can actually create a problem. So people may just be paralyzed and not know how to answer. So another approach may be, what are your barriers? What are the barriers you have into achieving your best life? And then have them list those and say, okay, what if we got rid of all those barriers? What would your life look like? And that might be another way to circumvent back to what you're really trying to get, which is kind of this aspirational value, emotion, feeling of what they want to get out of the world. Okay? So I'm going to stop sharing. We will field questions. Monica and I are happy to field questions. This is the time where I'm going to put the poll up. Please take the poll before you leave. We're here for Q&A. And the questions, we're open for questions before we go into community group. One of the things I will tell you is if you do have a question, Cindy's monitoring it. If you just write it in there, she will let you read it to the group. Or if you are so inclined, you can unmute yourself and say something.
Scott, one thing I'll say while people are thinking of their questions is back to your point about recording interviews. If you are able to get permission to record your interviews, that's always a really great thing to do. It allows you to have more of a natural conversation with people, and you can stop thinking about what you're trying to capture either by writing it or taking notes, trying to observe, ask the questions, everything at the same time. You can really just focus like on that person, and when you have that face-to-face, eye-to-eye contact, and you're not busy scribbling things down, you're able to have a more natural conversation. And I find often that you can get more information from them. They really feel like they're connecting with you more, and they'll open up to you more. So you're going to probably get more out of the experience by doing it that way. But again, emphasizing permissions and full disclosure that you're recording and all of those things, of course, but it is a nice tool.
So there is a question, Cindy. I was going to actually just read this one out loud. I think it is potentially relevant. I'm going to tell you that I'm not 100% certain on the participatory action research learning model. Are you familiar with that one, Monica?
Yeah, a little bit.
So the question is, how is this the same or different than the participatory action research learning approach?
Yeah, so participatory action research it's even more embedded probably. So again, for the purposes of design thinking and what you're looking to gain and the amount of time really that you're going to spend on it, it's probably a little bit more scaled back. It's more focused on the interviews plus observations, but less embedded than traditional ethnography or participatory research. So community-based or participatory research, you're really hyper involved, and it takes a little bit more time typically, but they are very closely related. A lot of the things that we seek in both are happening there. So, but probably just more involvement in participatory.
Hey, Scott, we have a question from Namisha.
Yeah.
How can we put this into practice in current context when being there in person is not really possible?
Yeah, great. That is actually a great question. So, I mean, the short answer is you can use Zoom. You could do this via Zoom if you'd like. It's not ideal. All right. So there really isn't an ideal way. I know also, Namisha, your organization is international, right? So you could, you can use, I think Zoom is better than nothing, right? The thing that you want to investigate before you choose to go the route of a digital conversation is how comfortable the other party is in the digital conversation, right? Because again, just like everything else we talked about, getting them comfortable is so important in this approach. It is so critically important because you want an authentic conversation. Monica, did you want to weigh in on that?
No, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with what you just said on that one.
Daniel Pearson, Dan, do you want to ask your comment to Scott? It's about typical interview lengths. How long do they last? Let's see. Go ahead, Daniel.
Sure, yeah, just how long does a typical interview last? And then how do you manage power dynamics if someone seems to be giving sort of pleasing answers? Yep. How do you put them at ease?
Yeah, great question. Let me start with the length, and I'll let Monica weigh in on the power. How about that? Because I'm curious to hear what she's going to say. On the length, I would say because of the nature of it, you want probably at least a half hour. Is the quickest I think you can do one of these. I would say anything, if you go an hour, that's probably going to be the back end amount of time for an interview. But what would be really awesome is if you can do the half hour, or if you could do even the hour, and also get to observe the person's life a little bit too, or their experience in your program or the condition that they're having. Monica, do you want to weigh in on the power?
Yeah, and I would just say additionally too, if you do have the opportunity for a follow-up interview, sometimes that's good too. That's not always the case, and that's not convenient or not built into your time structure. But if you're able to, sometimes a follow-up interview, you'll gain that relationship and you'll get even more. As far as the power dynamic, again, back to kind of what Scott said before, you really want to think about who's doing the interviewing if possible. If you have a few people that you can choose from, who might be the best person to do that for the scenario. Back to recording interviews, if you can really get at having a genuine conversation with someone, the more that you can make it an authentic, genuine experience. Again, you're letting them do the talking, but you want to have an environment where they feel comfortable talking to you, which may be less so if you're like busy writing things down and doing your official work while you're doing that. So just thinking about like what you look like as you're in that scenario.
I'm going to take a question out of order here, but I'll come back to you guys, so don't worry. But this one just kind of is about what we're talking about. So this is from Preetha. Does someone who is from the culture, example, someone from Kenya interviewing Kenyans in Swahili have an advantage over someone who is not originally from there as far as comfort level or power dynamic?
Yeah, I mean, comfort level definitely. Power dynamic probably depends on their relationship within the culture. And I think Daniel's question is so critically important, right? So I would generally not want like a supervisor collecting this information from someone they supervise, to your point. And so depending on I don't know much about Kenya. I do know in South Africa, I'm aware of some of the power dynamics within tribal cultures there, that you wouldn't want the chief to be the one collecting the information because of potential lack of individual may not feel as comfortable being candid. But yeah, if you're from the culture and can speak the language, it's a huge deal. Monica?
Yeah, I would say it's circular too, to some degree, because you want to know enough about the culture that you're trying to seek information about so that you can provide a service or a program or a product and really fulfill a need. So you need to know enough, but you need to do the research to know more, and then it just goes on from there. So it's all about adding to your information level and your knowledge base of the group that you're working with.
Scott, can I join in here?
Yeah.
Okay. I think what's important here as well, for those who don't know, Wim van Klinkenhap is a senior fellow at the Midwest Center. You need to be aware of your own biases. So if you're part of the culture you might make a lot of assumptions and you do not stay neutral. So that's the part I want to add to this conversation, that yes, it's helpful to be part of the culture, to understand nuances, but you also make a lot of assumptions. So how do you find that balance between staying neutral, objective, and also understanding the nuances of what people are saying and lingo?
Yeah, that's a great point.
That's a great point, which is also why I like recording content versus just relying on the data capture person to interpret all the content. Because if you're part of a team that's doing the analysis of the data, you don't have the filter of the data collector being the only voice in there. So I like raw story collection more than interpretation in the process. I do want to get to one other one here, and then I think we have to throw you guys into groups. This is fantastic, the number of questions.
I know. Do you have one you want to address, Scott? Or?
Yeah, I want to address the qualitative versus quantitative, right? Because I think it's from Jose Rodriguez. I think it's such a critical question in this process. I'm a quant researcher traditionally, right? So I do like quantitative data. I think one of the key points on quantitative versus qualitative, and the other quantitative researchers get mad at me sometimes for saying this, but quantitative data is really good as long as the environment is static and there's not a lot of change going on. But even when you're building a theory that ultimately you will test with quantitative data, you always start with qualitative approaches. Qualitative helps you to understand the environment you're working in, so that you can then do larger scale studies of quantitative. So in the context of program development, you would use qualitative as a much better approach to building a program. Then you can shift to quantitative evaluation metrics because you have actually built a framework from which you can use larger scale quantitative data analysis. But it's not particularly useful when you're trying to understand something and we're looking forward versus backward. Monica, do you want to weigh in on this since you're more qualitative, I think, than?
Yeah, I too love the quantitative, but I find a lot of value in qualitative. I think for me, you can look at quantitative data and there's, I think a good example is right now as we look at all of the COVID data and everything, there's a bunch of different models. They all tell a little bit different thing. There's no perfect measure or perfect model, as much as we strive for that in quantitative data. So I think particularly when you're looking at social dynamic and you're looking at human-centered data, it gets even more fuzzy. And so I think when you have that mindset that there's no perfect measure, you can really approach it in a little bit more open-minded way, and you're going to gather more in some scenarios from qualitative data. You can always use quantitative to support it or to validate it. There's lots of ways to do that, but I think qualitative really has a special approach with human-centered and social research.
So, Monica, do you mind setting people up for the rooms, and we can let them go a little longer since the evaluation's already out. What we will do with the other questions, we'll send a follow-up email thanking everybody for being on this call, and also with the video link. And we'll have these questions. We can download these questions when we do that. And so we'll make an effort to answer these questions the remaining questions for you also. And that way everybody can kind of have access to them. So Monica's finishing that up. If you haven't done the poll, please do so. Otherwise, enjoy your community time.
All right, so on our last session last week, we talked about empathetic listening and ethnography in the design thinking process, and we had a couple of questions that we wanted to follow up and answer. The first question was, when you speak to creating a culture, how would you suggest creating understanding and buy-in from your colleagues, especially when there's no urgency to change current practices?
Yeah, so good question. Probably a better question than we'll have an answer for. So there's actually some research on this, and most people either think about culture change from one of two perspectives. They either think about it from top down or bottom up. And the reality is you need both. right? So if it's just top down, you can get resistance from the lower level people who will wait a change out. If it's bottom up, obviously the problem is the core decision makers aren't, if they're not bought in, and oftentimes they won't be as quickly bought in if it's coming up straight from the bottom. So what you actually have to do is be very intentional, no matter what the culture change is, but in this case about creating an empathetic listening culture. You probably need teams that are represented from throughout the organizational hierarchy to be working on this to affect change throughout the entire organization.
I agree with that. I think you definitely need people from every area working together on this. I also think that it's a dedication to the practice itself. So I think in order to develop any kind of culture, I think that if you want to make those changes, you really need to dedicate yourself, your team, your organization to using that practice, employing that practice on a regular basis. If it's going to be just kind of a one-time thing, that's not going to create a culture around that. It's going to have to be something that is constantly used, talked about, lived, and believed in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's a good point. It's also one of the things with empathy in general, which is try to, ironically, empathy, right? Try and be considerate of how this approach can fit into existing behaviors, right? So it doesn't have to, I think sometimes these changes fail because they become additive instead of incorporated into the way we interact with each other. And so being intentional, to your point, and making this authentic and not just another fad that's kind of sweeping through the company.
I agree. So our other question was, do you have an example of how using the ethnography approach improved or impacted an organization's goals?
Yes. I think, on a for-profit side, the example that I've become familiar with is at Kroger grocery stores, the Kroger grocery conglomerate, where the CEO, Dave Dillon, employed, I don't think he would call it ethnography. I don't think that was particularly in his lexicon as he was managing, but took this approach of constant feedback from the customer, observation. In fact, he would tell a story about he would spend the week before Thanksgiving actually in the grocery store, just observing customer behavior, observing what was being bought, what wasn't being bought, talking to people. And the reason he would do it that week is his philosophy was, if I could get it right that week, I can get it right any week. And so I think that's a classic example. And they rose from the number 6 grocer in the country to number 2. Walmart was always number 1. And I think it's an excellent example of how employing an ethnographic orientation or style to your leadership and strategy has tangible benefits.
I think the ethnographic model, I like how you said that, because I think it's something where you can have something really involved and you can have an approach that is ethnography, and it can be very detailed, and every step of the way can really fit what that methodology is, but you can also take it as observations, seeing what's going on in your organization, making adjustments accordingly, which I think are things that people do all the time and maybe don't realize that they're employing those ethnographic approaches. So I think it's something that if you have taken in observations and made adjustments from that, you've probably done a little bit of ethnographic work within your organization, maybe without even realizing it.
Yeah, and these questions actually parallel each other, because I think when it works and it has tangible benefits, it's authentic, which is what you talked about previously. So it's not just a one-off. Now, I will say that I think a lot, and I think this goes to your point, Monica, that a lot of organizations, startups that are successful in the startup process and moving from idea to startup have done ethnography. Right, they've actually gone, and especially in the nonprofit sector, and spent time with the people who are experiencing the problem that they're trying to solve. Maybe they come from that environment themselves, and so the idea is generated from being a part of that environment, which would be, again, consistent with an ethnographic approach. And they've actually employed ethnography whether they knew it or not, in the actual startup phase for those that are successful. The contrary to that would be somebody like me who, let's say, is not a part of the Northeast section of Kansas City, Missouri, who just has an idea and says, you should do this in Northeast Kansas City, without actually spending any of the time seeing how people, lives are impacted by whatever, the various elements of the current environment. I just think I have an idea that everybody should apply. That's the reverse side of it, right? The side that I think is most successful is it comes from an ethnographic orientation, that it emerges from the needs of the people.
I agree. Those are our questions from this past week. We're happy to answer more questions if we don't get to them during our session. So look for future follow-up videos if we have any other questions to answer. Definitely be sure to put those in the chat so that we can get to those either during or later. And we thank everyone for tuning in. Thanks.
Thank you.